Hi everyone, my name's Tom Wootton. I'm the Head of Product and Portfolio for Access Services at Red Bee Media, and I'm delighted to have been invited to give a short talk, Automatic for the People, on how we can look at responsibly deploying automatic technologies for the use of captioning to the 7th Symposium on Live Subtitling and Accessibility 2020. So as part of the process of submitting this paper, it goes through a peer review, out of which came 3 questions. Asking me, what I thought about automatic speech recognition. Did I think it was inevitable? Did I think it was necessary? And did I think it was a good thing? And I think that's a good place to start to frame this short talk, because I hope to be able to answer whether I think it's necessary and a good thing during the course of the presentation. But the question of whether it's inevitable allows me to sort of state an assumption around this talk, state my priors, if you like, which is that not only do I think automatic speech recognition is inevitable for the provision of captioning, but it's already happening. Over 50% of the media that comes through our doors at Red Bee Media goes through some sort of automatic speech recognition process. And this is delivering to the highest levels of quality and expectation amongst global broadcasters. And we also have our live automatic captioning solution, ARC, deployed for customers in the United States, where they're using it for regulated live content, news, and doing it in a satisfactory way. So I think the question of whether automatic speech recognition for captioning, whether that's inevitable, is a bit outdated now. And what I really wanted to do with this talk is look at how we can deploy it and use it successfully. What things do we need to think about? And I think the first place to start is just this stakeholder map. So what I've got here are what I consider to be the main stakeholders that define the captioning space. That is to say, audiences, lobby groups, regulators, providers, and broadcasters. And they will interrelate in a number of ways in terms of feedback. Broadcasters and providers will often do reporting. Regulators will arbitrate between the different stakeholder groups and enforce any legislation and regulation that's in place. And audiences and lobby groups will bring together feedback and praise, but also complaints or areas that can be improved to feed into that process. And together we define that captioning space. So if we're thinking about defining automatic captioning, we also need to think about these particular stakeholders. Now, an important point here is I think historically the discourse around automatic speech recognition, as I say, has been about whether it's good or bad, whether we should do it or shouldn't do it. And really, the questions always need to be good for whom, good for which contexts, which programs, which content. And again, in order to do that, we need to expand our frameworks and just think about our frameworks in a wider context. So specifically with quality, the 3 sort of parameters that I've put here are presence, are captions available for a specific program or channel? And I think this one is often forgotten when we talk about quality, which is for an awful lot of programming, quality of the actual captions, their accuracy or comprehensibility, isn't really a factor at all, because there are no captions there. So presence is a really important one to consider when we're thinking about what automatic speech recognition can do for accessibility. The second parameter is availability or uptime. So our captions continuously available for expected programs. And the third is what we typically mean when we talk about quality. Are captions accurate and comprehensible? That tends to be defined through a mixture of regulator description. It's rarely statistical definition, it's usually description. And broadcaster and service provider evaluation and audience feedback. And I don't need to tell anyone here, they tend to be a combination of accuracy of subtitle text compared to the spoken content, latency, reading speed, presentational aspects, and positioning. But I think the point of separating it out in this way is that we can start to see some of the levers that automatic speech recognition can pull. For instance, if we think about reducing the quality slightly, the accuracy quality slightly, can we increase the presence? And I think we need to be thinking in this space when we think about the responsible and beneficial deployment for automatic captioning. I also wanted to just cover the commercial dynamics that, if you like, some of those stakeholder groups imply. what they mean for caption provision, just in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to make a statement here that I think is important, which is that I think regulation provides both the assurance of caption service provision, so it means it has to happen, but it does also mean it creates a limit about where you can expect to find good quality captions. So I think there is a cold, hard truth here, which is that regulation is a recognition that there is insufficient commercial value in captioning to ensure it takes place without that regulatory framework or that legislative framework. Now, that's fine, and we tend to operate in regulated markets where that framework does exist. But there are a couple of limitations there. So regulation cycles typically take time to catch up with technology, and I think we're seeing this particularly at the moment. I'll come on to that with the sort of grey areas section. And regulation will take place. The regulator will arbitrate between those different stakeholders, and that means one factor in that regulation, one limit on that regulation. It comes out to broadcaster negotiation based upon cost trade-offs and various trade-offs to do with how much and how much will it cost. So there is a limiting space around regulation. Regulation is entirely beneficial, but it does also define the area where we have typically expected to find captions in the past. However, there are an increasing number of grey areas where audiences expect captioning, but those areas are not necessarily regulated or are only semi-regulated. So audiences are increasingly expecting a frictionless experience between linear broadcast on the television and streaming services. There's less and less distinction between them, and it will become increasingly confusing for audiences why, say, they can have accessibility on one of those services and not the other. The more frictionless it becomes, the more noticeable the absence of certain features becomes. And we're seeing this already. People expect captions for a linear showing to also be on a streaming platform. But that also increases expectations around streaming services generally, where there hasn't been a linear showing of a particular program. So people aren't just expecting it to be frictionless within a broadcaster environment, but generally expect the same level of service. And there are areas of, if you like, sort of important informational value, such as live online news services, where again, captions are sort of seen as a responsible requirement to allow deaf, hard of hearing, deaf and hearing impaired people to access those services. So the final framework I wanted to cover here is audiences. We've typically always focused on the core audience of deaf and hearing impaired people, that social responsibility. And of course, we're seeing an increase in the hearing impairment in the wealthier aging societies that we see as they become older. Increasingly, and this has come as an interesting area for me, seeing the value of captions, same language captions for neurodiverse societies or people with some form of neurodiversity. Really how those captions can assist, especially where there's some challenges to the specific media, if it's quite noisy or if those people are in a noisy environment. So that collectively is actually quite a large group. The size of people with some form of neurodiversity in the UK and people with some form of deaf and hearing impaired people is about the same number, roughly. And while there must be some overlap between those two, that actually represents quite a sizable proportion of people in the market. So that actually, obviously, is a good argument to stress the value of captions to broadcasters, to their audience needs and requirements. But of course, we've always tried to talk a little bit about the benefits of captioning to everyone, the whole of society, because accessibility, it can very much depend on context. And we've often talked about the consumption of media in public spaces or noisy contexts. The increased consumption of media on mobile devices in noisy environments, which has seen a huge increase in the use of subtitles and captions amongst the younger demographics. So that's been an interesting change in consumption of subtitles, as well as things like social media sharing, second language users, and indeed where naturalistic speech is used in programs such as slang, dialect, mumbling, how captions can benefit all audiences. But the fact remains, although we've stressed these arguments to really sort of push forward the value of captions, that regulation has still been required because the cost of captioning has been perceived to be too much for the actual value. So there's a cost value argument, which fundamentally, while it was human driven, presented challenges to providing more captioning beyond regulation. So how can automation help with some of these dynamics? Well, it can help by reducing the barriers to captioning. Lower cost automation means that traditional non-regulatory arguments, those ones we just covered for caption provision, become far more potent. In terms of presence, more programs can be covered due to lower production costs. In terms of availability, actually, automation can also help ensure continuous coverage, even if there's a technical problem. And for those grey areas, those sort of semi-regulated or non-regulated areas where increasingly people just expect captions, it allows for greater coverage on those digital and streaming platforms. And it means non-regulated content can start aligning with regulated programming in a way that audiences are increasingly expecting. But there is always a but. And of course, the crucial question is around caption quality. There are still challenges around automatic caption quality. And I don't need to tell anyone here about those challenges, but I'll just cover some of the important findings we've made while looking at evaluation of caption quality and automatic speech recognition. So automatic speech recognition is not equally high quality across all content. Now, we have typically found it is very good for news programs. We have typically found it is good for scripted or single speaker programs. And just to take an NER measurement of real-time automatic captioning, we are consistently seeing that hitting 98.5% on the NER model, with one exception, which I'll cover in a second. Now, we find sports varies. We still find that high volume ambient noise, music, people talking over each other, very strong accents, they remain challenging. They continue to degrade the quality. And we also find that not all errors are equal. So names, places, and domain-specific vocabulary are really important. So you have to look at ways that you can optimize for those. What we found was actually the arguments increasingly become not about the high quality, the top level of quality, what quality can it reach, if you like, but actually around the lower quality baseline. So a key finding in our internal analysis is it is not the quality that automatic captioning can achieve, but the lower bound that it can guarantee. And obviously an expert captioner can ensure that lower bound is actually quite high. It doesn't dip beneath a certain level. With automatic captioning, that lower bound can fluctuate within program content as well as across program content. So if there's a very noisy news report from a war zone, then the quality is going to be less good than for something which is in the studio. However, the general quality is significantly and sustainably high for that sort of content. And also automatic captioning lacks what you might call key expected captioning features. So punctuation is pretty good these days, though not always what you might do if you were a captioner. Speaker differentiation is still weak, but improvements are expected fairly soon. And in fact, may bring additional benefits like speaker diarization, the persistent identification of speakers through a program or across a series. So I think we're seeing that automatic captioning is working in a space, but it's not appropriate for everything. And one of the key things that we need to be able to do is to ensure that we understand where it can be used responsibly and where for the moment we shouldn't be using it and be using more traditional methods. So it does bring benefits, but we need to say benefits for whom, benefits where. So what's the suggested approach for managing these quite complicated dynamics that we just looked at? Well, I think it's essential that it's based on collaboration, that those same stakeholders that we saw at the beginning, the regulators, lobby groups, audiences, broadcasters, and providers that define the captioning space come together to define the automatic captioning space. And they'll need to do that with a sixth stakeholder, which is the technology providers. That is to say, the people responsible for automatic speech recognition and machine learning technologies. So within RED-B, we have always had a focus on looking to deploy automation in a way that is responsible to audiences, responsible to broadcasters, making sure we're absolutely transparent about the various quality trade-offs and where it can bring benefits, but where it's perhaps best not used, but also responsible to our internal subtitlers and captioners. And to do that, we bring together small cross-functional groups of experts designed to look at how we can best deploy, use automatic technology effectively. And I think something very similar will be needed across the industry. And I would like to think that, you know, this sort of framework that we've looked at here will just help break out some of those dynamics and enable us to build cross-functional teams in the industry to successfully deliver automatic captioning, which is truly automatic for the people. So to come back to those three initial questions, is it inevitable? Yes, it's already happening. Is it necessary? Probably yes, considering the increase in the media estate across digital and traditional linear. Captioning is expected to cover more and more, and we're seeing ever decreasing budgets in the media space as well. Something that has only been brought into sharp focus by COVID. And is it good? Well, my answer to that is it can be. It absolutely can be if we come together, if we collaborate to deliver automatic captioning successfully and in a way that is responsible for all the stakeholders in that space. Thank you very much.